to the Akedah Project.
We invite you to join.
One story, many angles.
Come learn with us.
Like almost all of the other great writers in the canon of Hebrew literature in the early modern and modern period, Agnon does utilize the Akedah. He draws on this classical canonical story which passes into Jewish mythos in his own writing. Of course, he has himself a very large canon of writings, so it will appear here and there. But like much of Hebrew literature, the use of the Akedah in Agnon is very often, not always, but very often, an inversion of the Akedah. When the Akedah is used as a symbol or as a motif in Hebrew literature, often it's not the Akedah of Abraham and Isaac as told in Genesis, in which there's a last-minute substitute. The angel calls at a minute to midnight with a reprieve, not from the governor, but from God himself, that we're not going to sacrifice Isaac. There's no substitute ram. Very often the Akedah in Hebrew literature results in the death of the child in this war or in that war or in the other war, or there's no end to wars we can draw on at different stages of Hebrew literature. This act of terror, either before the establishment of the state or after the establishment of the state, or generally as a symbol of the breakdown between the generations, between father and son. Now, this is a tradition that goes back to the Midrash itself, that couldn't imagine that they endure this challenge and Isaac doesn't die. There is a tradition in the Midrash that Abraham actually does slaughter Isaac, who is then miraculously brought back to life. Now, that might be motivated in the Midrash, in the rabbinic Midrash, by the idea that, well, unless Abraham actually goes through with it, then it's not really a test, because we wouldn't know what he would have done at that very last split second before the angel told him to stay his hand. But at least according to the simple reading of the text, Isaac is not slaughtered. And that is turned on its head very often when the Akedah is referenced as kind of a template for modern Hebrew literature. There are two major places where Agnon draws on the Akedah, and I'll deal with them in reverse order. In a late work, Ha'esh v'Ha'etzim, which was published in 1962, it was actually Agnon's final book that he produced in his lifetime. Agnon had a very curious post-career. He published more works after he died than he did in his own lifetime, and today we have collected 23 collected volumes of Agnon's writings. But this was an anthology of longer and shorter stories, which were published in 1962. He died, of course, in 1970, having received the Nobel Prize in 1966. And the title itself, Ha'esh v'Ha'etzim, the fire and the wood, is of course taken from the story of the binding of Isaac. They're headed off to Mount Moriah, and young Isaac looks around and says, "Hey, Dad, here's the fire and here's the wood. Where is the ram for the sacrifice?" And Abraham tells his son, God will provide the sacrifice. Wink, wink. We readers know what's going on, what Isaac himself doesn't yet understand. And this is a collection of stories which doesn't directly address the Holocaust, save for one very important story, but in which there's an undercurrent. A Hebrew author sitting in Jerusalem in the 1950s and 60s writing stories can't escape from the presence of the Holocaust, even though the Holocaust itself plays, at least on the surface, a rather scant amount of Agnon's writing. Much of his writing, of course, was completed before the war, but even after the war, he was writing stories about the old world in Europe that was destroyed, and the old world here in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, principally during the period of the second Aliyah, when he himself first arrives in Jaffa and then later Jerusalem. That's the decade or so before World War I. But very many of these stories have taken the collection in total are stories of loss, are stories of trauma. And in the major story in the collection, a work called Hasiman, in English it's translated as The Sign, he's explaining through this kind of fictional narrator who bears a lot of resemblance to the author himself, what it was like to be sitting in Jerusalem on the eve of the Shavuot holiday in 1943 and to receive the news that your hometown Buchach, this little Galician town in which he was born and raised, what today is in western Ukraine, what then was in the eastern reaches of when he lived there, it was the eastern reaches of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that it had been destroyed in the war. The town had been destroyed, but the Jewish population of many thousands of Jews had been slaughtered and killed, and it's quite unique in Holocaust literature because it's a Holocaust story that takes place in Jerusalem, not in Poland, not in Auschwitz, and it's how he absorbs it and how it changes him, how he becomes how he understands it as an initiation to his role as a chronicler of a world that has now been destroyed. And the title of the collection, Ha'esh V'Ha'etzim, is as if it's saying, what's the substitute? In the story of the Akedah, there's this ram that appears at the last minute to stand in for Isaac. In our Akedah, perhaps it is we that are the substitute. And if not me personally, then the Jewish people collectively that suffers the sacrifice without that last minute reprieve. And if the Jewish people are sacrificed, then I alone am left to tell the tale. And that's how he conceives of his work as a Hebrew author. But the major center of his focus on the Akedah is his long novel, his magnum opus, in Hebrew called Tmol Shilshom, in English translated as Only Yesterday from Princeton University Press. And it's the story of a young Ole, an immigrant to Palestine in that decade before World War I. There are a lot of biographical parallels to his own arrival, but the main character is not autobiographical. It's a character named Yitzchak Kummer, Isaac Kummer, and the choice of the name Isaac, of course, cannot be an accident. The novel begins with the following lines. Like all of our brethren of the second Aliyah, the bearers of our salvation, Isaac Kummer left his country and his homeland and his city and ascended to the land of Israel to build it from its destruction and to be rebuilt by it. So one attuned to the rhythms of the biblical text will hear he left his country, Artso, and his homeland, Moladato, and his city, Iro. In other words, Agnon sometimes will play off a biblical text, but by altering the biblical text, he draws attention to something. Of course, the original biblical text from Lech Lecha, the call to Abraham to travel to Canaan, says, Vayomer Hashem el Avram, Lech Lecha me'artzecha u'mimoladetecha u'mibeit avicha. Where Isaac, in our story, leaves his country and his homeland and his city, Abraham leaves his country and his homeland and his father's house. Isaac doesn't leave his father's house, even though he physically leaves this. And here it really is parallel to Agnon, who at the age of 20 leaves his little hometown and really, with only one exception, never returns. But like so many great authors, like Mark Twain, like Philip Roth, like so many others, you can take the boy out of Buchach, but you can't take the Buchach out of the boy, and it remains with him and in his pen throughout his very long career, spent mostly in Jerusalem, but imaginatively back in the Altaheim, in the old world, in the old town. Isaac doesn't leave Beit Aviv. He doesn't leave his father's house because it remains with him. And when he arrives in Jaffa, secular Jaffa of the second Aliyah, modern Zionism, like most of the other young immigrants of that time, he temporarily abandons traditional observance, and he removes his yarmulke, and he becomes lazy about his prayers and Sabbath observance and other things. And then he leaves Jaffa to go to Jerusalem. And the novel is set up with these 4 passages from Jaffa to Jerusalem, back to Jaffa, back to Jerusalem, from the modern secular world of Jaffa. Outside of his window, he can see on the sand dunes this new city which is being built, which we of course know will become Tel Aviv, to the old world of the old Yishuv, the old settlement of Jerusalem, which looked very much like the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods of Jerusalem still do. And he goes to Mea Sha'arim, and he's vacillating back and forth between modern and old, between secular and pious, between 2 love interests. One, a modern girl, actually what my grandmother would have called a real fast girl, and a more pious old world young maidel from Mea Sha'arim. And this tension between the worlds is his Akedah. It's his challenge, right? He is caught between the thorns of these two worlds, and he's trying to find a way forward. In the end, and we're really cutting it short here, and you owe it to yourself to read the whole novel, because for about 200 pages in a 600-page novel, the narration is given over to a sentient dog whose name is Balak. People familiar with the parasha of Balak will be puzzled. Why would Agnon call a dog after this wicked Moabite king? But Balak, who is sentient in the sense that we, the reader, have a picture of what he's thinking in his head. He's not communicating with the human characters like in an Aesop fable, but we know what he's thinking. We know his thoughts as he makes his way around Jerusalem, and he's hiding underneath the table while the famous rabbis are delivering their sermons, and we get a peek into the old world of Jerusalem through the eyes and nose of this dog, who becomes rabid. And because of a kind of careless mistake that Isaac makes, Balak bites Isaac. And Isaac, who has now married, has settled down with this pious young woman from a rabbinic family in Jerusalem, who seems to have kind of made his way out and back and out and back again, dies a senseless death. And this is how it's described. The neighbors were talking about Isaac and saying that his mind is not sane. And imaginative people imagine they saw him crawling on all fours, shouting like a dog and running after every person to bite him. Fear fell on folks, and they complained about letting a dangerous person walk around in public. This is the onset of his rabies, which then, of course, had no treatment, had no cure. The officers of the communal society heard those words and sent a doctor to him. The doctor saw Isaac and said, "We have to take him to Egypt, to the Pasteur Institute, where he can be cared for." Meanwhile, the bitten man has to be bound with ropes and put in a separate room behind a locked door. They bound Isaac with ropes and put him in a room by himself and locked the door behind him and closed the shutters. And they brought him water and food. Because he was so weak, he didn't eat and didn't drink. Isaac sat alone in the dark room and lamented. And from there, it's all downhill until he dies a tragic death. And with his death, the drought that had been plaguing Jerusalem for days and months is alleviated, and rain comes. And like many of Agnon's books, it kind of ends on a sad note, on a tragic note. Although there's promise that in the future, Jewish life will develop, and there'll be a way to find balance without having to be bound down. But the overall arc of this kind of modern Akedah is the is the skeleton on which Agnon constructs this long, meandering novel. And I've left out most of the details, which again I really do commend to our listeners' attention to read the whole thing. But this is the kernel of the work. Agnon looks at the Akedah and says, well, in modern Hebrew literature, Isaac dies. There is no reprieve. But why does he die? Why does he suffer? Is it a cruel God at work? Is it merely meaningless happenstance? Is it just a kind of grotesque plot in which we understand how people suffered when very many people suffered when they came here to the land of Israel to build it and be built by it? Well, not everybody was built by it. The second Aliyah was, for very many, a tragedy. Many people left. They couldn't make it here in the land of Israel. But the narrator is the novel was first published in 1945, although large sections of it were already written and published in installments much earlier, going back to the early 1930s. But the final part of the novel is completed and published in 1945. And some have speculated that at that point already, he is addressing the Holocaust. He's addressing what had happened abroad, what was happening here in the land of Israel, the work that we had to do at that point, just a few years before the establishment of the state, the struggles that we would have to be going through. There were going to be a lot of tragedies. There had been, and there would be more, a lot of sacrifices. And not every sacrifice has a substitute ram that's going to come and save the day. And how do we look at that? We can draw wisdom from thinking about the Akedah and its interactions with modern Jewish history, modern Jewish life, modern Jewish learning, and modern Jewish literature. That's part of what many of the great Hebrew authors were doing. And Agnon just does it in a way that creates really one of the masterpieces of modern Jewish literature, not just Hebrew literature, which is really worthy of our attention. He rarely, almost never engaged in the kind of interpretation of his own work. He would very often give very playful but not helpful answers when people would approach him. People would say, well, what does this mean? What does that symbol mean? What does this other thing mean? And he would say, I don't know, go ask this professor, go ask that person. There's a well-known anecdote. Agnon's granddaughter, who's actually a neighbor of mine here in Israel, in Efrat, Agnon's granddaughter it's the 1960s, she gets homework to write something on one of her grandfather's stories. And in his own lifetime, he was, the most well-regarded Hebrew author. His works were being studied in high school and college. She goes to see her grandfather. He dictates to her all the answers, and they got a B-. So sometimes the author himself is not the best interpreter of the work. However, in this one case, the great literary critic Baruch Kurzweil, who was one of the pioneers in the field of study of Agnon, asked him about this symbol balak. It's just so curious that we have this dog, and the whole plot turns, on this dog. And Agnon pointed him to a passage in the Talmud, in the Tractate of Sotah, that more or less says that when a person sins, the sin is attached to him, it clings to him like a rabid dog. And somehow this has led generations of literary scholars to interpret Balak, this dog, as an extension, as the alter ego of Yitzchak himself, that he's done in by himself. But that's just one speculative reading. I'm very often asked by Israelis, how could you possibly translate? How could you possibly read Agnon in English? That's just natural Israeli chauvinism. The same way that in Moscow, somebody would ask, how could you read Tolstoy in translation? And in Spain, they would say, how could Cervantes be understood not in the original? And what would we do with Shakespeare in a foreign language? You would lose everything. But the answer is that, of course, that's ridiculous. We all have read classic literature in translation. We all understand that if you're able to read Tolstoy in Russian and Cervantes in Spanish and Shakespeare in English, it's best to do so. But we are not all polyglots in that way. And there's no reason that somebody who can't read Agnon in the original shouldn't read him in English. That being said, of course, a lot is lost in translation. A lot is lost between the lines, particularly Agnon's, perhaps the major subject of his work is the intertextuality, is having taken the entire corpus of Jewish and Hebrew literature from the Bible, the rabbinic interpretations, the Midrash, the Mishnah, the Talmud, medieval Hebrew literature, medieval Hebrew poetry, and so on and so forth, up to the modern writers, Hebrew and Yiddish writers that had come before him. It's taking it all and distilling it down and pouring it into the mold of modern literature. That was his great accomplishment. And someone who is unfamiliar with all of those works, someone who won't catch all of the resonances and the references, someone who will read Shmol Shel Shom and be ignorant of the fact that it's drawing on Akedat Yitzchak, is of course going to miss a lot. Perhaps they're going to miss the main part of it. Presumably those judges in Stockholm that gave him the Nobel Prize in 1966 also read him in translation. As a matter of fact, we know for a fact that they read him in translation, but yet they still recognized that this was great world literature worthy of recognition, even though presumably they didn't get it all. The question is not so much how can we read Agnon in translation, but how can a Hebrew speaker who tragically today is cut off from the sources, or many of those books that are behind you and I on our screens right now, somebody who's not conversant in the Jewish bookshelf, how can they read, even if they're able to access Agnon in the original Hebrew? That's the real question, and that's a real challenge. There has been, of course, a revival of interest in Agnon in the last number of years, as is the nature of all great authors. There are ups and downs. There are moments of greater popularity and moments in which their reputation fades. Agnon, being the only Hebrew Nobel laureate in literature, maintains there's a certain reverence around him, a certain interest in him, even among people who don't necessarily bother to read him. And that's our work at the Agnon House in Jerusalem. We're trying to promote his legacy, not just because we have an interest in his memory, but because we think that what he writes has something to say to contemporary Israel and to contemporary Jewish life. And that's part of what our mission is. The viewers are welcome to come and visit us in happier non-Corona times, when you can come to visit Jerusalem, to come visit us at the Agnon House in Jerusalem, to learn more about him and to see his library and his home in which he lived, and to understand what the meaning of his writing is to ongoing Jewish life.